Carl Jung once documented a psychological shift so subtle yet so destabilizing that he believed most people would never recognize it while it was happening. He observed individuals, often empaths, who appeared gentle, accommodating, even broken, until something inside them quietly reorganized, not into rage, not into bitterness, but into clarity. People like to say healing makes you softer, more forgiving, more at peace. And yes, sometimes it does. But Jung noticed something deeper, something far less comforting to those who relied on your softness. When an empath truly heals, they don't become nicer, they become harder to move. And that is what unsettles people. Because the empath you used to be was not naive, you were surviving. You learned to read emotional weather because chaos lived close to you. You learned to feel what others denied. And while the world told you that sensitivity was a weakness, Jung saw it as a highly differentiated form of perception, one that had simply never been allowed to integrate its shadow. What happens when it does? When the anger you buried, the boundaries you were taught to fear, and the intuition you kept doubting finally return to consciousness, you don't lose your heart, you gain structure, and structure changes everything. In this video, I want to show you what Jung discovered about the healed empath. Not the version people romanticize, but the one that emerges when the spell finally ends. If you're an empath, you probably weren't too sensitive. You were just raised in rooms where sensitivity was a survival skill. You walk into a room and you already know, not with thoughts, your body knows. You can feel who's irritated, who's performing, who's waiting for you to smooth things over. You notice the tiny shifts other people miss. The pause before someone answers. The forced smile that doesn't reach the eyes. The heaviness in the air that everyone pretends isn't there. Most people call that intuition. Empaths know it's something else. It's vigilance that became a personality. And Jung saw this pattern in case after case. People who looked gentle, agreeable, easy to be around, but who were quietly carrying an entire system on their backs. Not because they were weak, because they were built, trained, conditioned to absorb impact. The gift didn't come from light, it came from environments where you had to read the room to stay safe. A parent whose rage could ignite without warning. A household where depression wasn't spoken, but it filled every corner. A relationship where silence was not peace, it was punishment. When you grow up inside that kind of atmosphere, your nervous system adapts. It becomes finely tuned to emotional frequency. You don't just hear words, you track what's underneath the words. You learn to pick up on what's denied, what's hidden, what's about to spill. Jung called this unconscious participation. The moment you stop being a person in your own life and start becoming a container for other people's inner world. Their tension enters you. Their shame finds a home in you. Their denied pain uses you like a storage unit. And here's the disturbing part. Because you can feel it, you start to believe it's yours to manage. That's how empathy becomes self-abandonment without you noticing. You say yes when your body is saying no, because no feels dangerous. You tell yourself you're being kind, but the truth is you're avoiding consequences you were trained to fear: rejection, anger, withdrawal, the cold distance that tells you you've done something wrong. You become an expert in keeping things fine. You learn how to phrase your needs so they sound smaller than they are. You learn to explain yourself before anyone accuses you, because being misunderstood has always been painful for you. And slowly you begin living as what Jung might call an emotional shock absorber. You take the hit so the room can stay calm. You take the blame so the relationship can stay intact. You take responsibility for feelings that never belong to you. From the outside, it can look like love. It can look like loyalty. It can look like spiritual maturity. But inside, something else is happening. You start confusing empathy with carrying. You think understanding someone's wounds means you must endure their behavior. You mistake your ability to feel people deeply as a sign that it's your job to save them. And because you can explain them, because you can map their pain so clearly, you keep overriding your own alarm system. This is what Jung meant when he warned that what you deny doesn't vanish. It goes into the shadow. For many empaths, the shadow isn't cruelty. It's the parts of you were trained to label as selfish, anger, boundaries, the right to leave, the ability to disappoint someone and still stand in your own truth. So you push those parts down. You become easy. You become the one who understands. You become the one who apologizes for existing. And after a while, you don't even realize how much you've edited yourself. Your needs start to feel like inconveniences. Rest starts to feel like guilt. Saying no starts to feel like you're hurting people, even when you're simply protecting your own energy. This is why unhealed empaths are so valuable to the wrong people. Not because they're stupid, not because they're naive, because they're predictable in the most exploitable way. They'll keep translating cruelty into stress. They'll keep calling disrespect a misunderstanding. And they'll do it with a calm face so nobody sees the cost, because the cost isn't always dramatic. It's quieter than that. It's the slow disappearance of the real you. You stop trusting what your body is telling you. You stop honoring the moment you feel drained and call it being too sensitive. You stay emotionally available while your inner world goes numb, not from lack of feeling, but from carrying too much feeling that wasn't yours to carry. That's why I'm going to say this clearly, because it may be the first time you've heard it this way. Unhealed empathy doesn't look like love. It looks like disappearing quietly so everyone else can stay comfortable. And if you recognize yourself here, don't shame yourself. This was never a character flaw. It was a survival adaptation that kept working long after the danger was gone. But survival has a limit. And then something happens, usually not gentle. Something that forces the empath to finally see. The breaking point isn't when you lose your mind, it's when you stop negotiating with reality. Most people imagine an empath's breaking point as something loud, tears, rage, a dramatic exit. They expect the collapse to look like chaos because the empath has carried chaos for so long. But Jung noticed something colder than that. In many cases, the moment the spell ends doesn't arrive as a breakdown. It arrives as a kind of stillness, a silence that isn't submission anymore, a quiet that finally belongs to you. Let me tell you a case story. There's a woman, let's call her Elena. She's the one everyone calls when something goes wrong. The one who remembers birthdays, keeps the peace at family dinners, checks in on people who never check in on her. In her relationship, she has been understanding for years, too understanding. She has translated inconsistency into stress. She has interpreted distance as he's overwhelmed. She has made excuses on his behalf before he even opened his mouth. And the strange part is, Elena is not unaware. She notices everything. She notices how he becomes affectionate right after he's hurtful, like sweetness is meant to erase the bruise. She notices the way her body tightens when his phone flips over on the table, screen down. She notices how she feels after certain conversations, drained, smaller, slightly ashamed for having needs. She notices. Then she talks herself out of noticing, because when you're an empath, denial doesn't look like ignorance. It looks like compassion used as anesthesia. It looks like telling yourself, it's not that bad, when your body is saying, this is not safe. It looks like choosing the story that keeps the relationship intact, because facing the truth would mean facing loss. So Elena keeps going. She keeps being kind. She keeps offering understanding where what's needed is accountability. She keeps the connection alive by erasing her own discomfort, until the day the truth stops being subtle. It's not always cheating, but sometimes it is. Sometimes it's money. Sometimes it's a conversation she overhears. Sometimes it's the moment she realizes he speaks about her with contempt when she isn't in the room. Sometimes it's one sentence, one careless line that reveals how he actually sees her. And when Elena discovers it, the shock isn't the betrayal itself. The real shock is this: she has known for a long time, not consciously, not in a way she could prove, but her nervous system knew, her intuition whispered, her body recorded every inconsistency. She simply kept overriding it because she thought that was what love was. This is what Jung would call the moment the shadow returns. For years, Elena has pushed certain parts of herself into the dark so she can remain good. The part that gets angry, the part that refuses, the part that says, enough. Those parts didn't disappear. They waited. And when the betrayal becomes undeniable, they come back, not as evil, not as cruelty, but as a boundary finally finding its voice. This is where a lot of people misunderstand anger. They think anger is a flaw. They think anger is immaturity. They think anger means you've failed to forgive. But Jung saw anger differently when it appears at the right moment. He saw it as psychic energy returning to the self, a signal that something crossed a line and the soul is done pretending it didn't. Anger in this form isn't about destroying someone, it's about returning to yourself. And this is where the empath's inner voice changes. Before the break, the empath's main question is usually, how do I understand them better? What happened to them? What wound made them act like this? Even when the empath is in pain, their gaze stays turned outward. After the break, the question turns inward. Not in selfishness, in sanity. Why am I calling this love? Why does my compassion only flow in one direction? What part of me thinks I deserve to be treated like this? That shift is the beginning of healing, and it can feel brutal because it's honest. This is also the moment cold clarity shows up. Cold clarity isn't hatred, it isn't revenge, it's the end of explaining away, it's the end of needing the other person to become better in order for you to be okay. You simply see. And what you see is often simple. The relationship has been built on your willingness to carry what the other person refuses to face. Your softness has been used as a shelter for their immaturity. Your empathy has been used as a loophole. When that becomes clear, something in you stops reaching for the old script. That's why certain people react so strongly when an empath wakes up. They don't react because you became cruel. They react because you became unavailable to the illusion. They relied on your tendency to question yourself. They relied on your habit of giving them one more chance. Cold clarity removes all of that without a fight. You might not even argue. You might not raise your voice, but your energy changes. Your eyes change. You're no longer persuadable. And for someone who benefited from your silence, your honesty can feel like punishment. So let me say this clearly because it matters. The empath doesn't become heartless here, they become honest. And honesty can feel brutal to people who benefited from your silence. Now we get to the part people misunderstand. What you become after healing isn't a wall, it's an inner structure. After healing, you don't stop feeling. You stop leaking. That's the line people miss when they talk about empaths. They assume the only way to survive is to become less sensitive, to harden, to shut down. They picture healing as a closing of the heart. But what actually happens when it's real, when it's Jungian, when the shadow has been faced, is almost the opposite. The empath doesn't become numb, they become contained. And containment is what makes your sensitivity finally feel like a gift instead of a liability. Because before, your empathy had no edges. If someone needed attention, you offered yours, even when you were already running on empty. It wasn't generosity, it was leakage. Your energy poured out of you in a way that felt like love, but left you hollow. Integration changes that, quietly, permanently, not in the sense that you become dangerous, not in the sense that you walk around trying to expose people. The integrated empath isn't a weapon, they're a threshold. And the difference between an open door and a threshold is everything. An open door means anyone can enter, any mood, any demand, any crisis, any story. You don't even ask whether it's yours to carry. You let it in because saying no triggers guilt, and guilt feels like abandonment. A threshold is different. A threshold has a pause built into it, a moment of discernment, a question that comes before access. Not are they hurting, because everyone is hurting. The real question becomes, is this safe for me to hold? This is why healthy people often feel calmer around a healed empath. They're not walking into a space where they can dump and leave. They're walking into a presence that is real, grounded, able to care without collapsing. It feels steady, and steadiness is deeply soothing to anyone who isn't trying to extract from you. But for manipulators, a threshold feels like a closed gate. They can sense it. They don't always know why, but they feel that the old tactics don't land. The urgency doesn't hook you, the guilt doesn't stick. The sob story doesn't automatically open your heart. You listen, yes, but you're not pulled into the emotional undertow. And here's what makes this so powerful. You don't have to announce your boundaries. You don't have to give a speech. You don't have to argue your way into being respected. Your energy has an edge now. Not a sharp edge that cuts people, a clear edge that defines what belongs to you. That's the first transformation. Then something else shifts, and this one is even quieter. You start trusting what you perceive without needing to prove it. The old empath often lived in a courtroom inside their mind. Every instinct had to be argued down. Every red flag had to be fair. Every uncomfortable feeling had to be backed by evidence before it was allowed to count. You didn't trust your perception because you were trained not to. You were told you were overreacting, too sensitive, reading into things, making problems. So you learned to doubt yourself even when your body was speaking in a language that had never lied to you. After integration, the courtroom closes, not because you stop thinking, because you stop negotiating with what you already know. You don't need to convince anyone that something feels off. You don't need the other person to admit it. You simply adjust your distance. This is one of the most misunderstood signs of healing. People will call it cold. They'll accuse you of being judgmental. They'll say you've changed, and you have. But the change isn't a lack of love. It's a new loyalty. You're loyal to reality now. You're loyal to your body. You're loyal to the truth you used to abandon just to keep the peace. And this is where this survival database comes in, but not in a dramatic way. If you've spent years reading rooms, reading faces, reading tone shifts, you've been collecting data whether you meant to or not. You've watched patterns repeat. You've watched how charm shows up right before a boundary gets crossed. You've watched how apologies get used as reset buttons instead of repairs. You've seen how certain people become kind only when they're afraid of losing access. The unhealed empath collects all of this and then talks themselves out of it. They use empathy to edit the truth. The healed empath doesn't do that anymore, not because they're suspicious of everyone, because they've stopped lying to themselves. You simply become more selective with your presence, which leads to the third transformation, and this one is where Jung's idea of moral courage matters. You stop being nice and you become truly kind. Nice is fear-based. It's the performance of goodness. It's keeping things smooth so nobody gets upset, even if you're the one paying the price. Nice often smiles while it's being wounded. True kindness is different. It doesn't aim to be liked, it aims to be honest. It can hold compassion without enabling dysfunction. It can say, "I care about you," and still refuse access to you. That is not cruelty, that is integrity. Jung understood that a person becomes whole when they integrate opposites: softness and strength, compassion and discernment, love and limits. An integrated empath can feel deeply and still remain rooted. They don't confuse intensity with intimacy. They don't confuse guilt with responsibility. They don't confuse someone's suffering with your assignment. And there's one detail that often shocks people. The healed empath usually becomes calmer, not louder. Because when you no longer need to prove your perception, you stop fighting. When you no longer leak your energy, you stop chasing. When you no longer need approval, you stop performing. That calmness is exactly what makes certain people nervous, not because you're threatening them, because you're no longer movable. Manipulation is a strategy that depends on motion. It needs you to react, it needs you to over-explain, but steadiness interrupts the entire mechanism. You don't become someone who attacks. You become someone who can pause. You can sense someone's anger and still refuse to carry it. You can love someone and still walk away if the relationship costs you your dignity. This is what love with a backbone actually looks like. It's not dramatic. It's not punitive. It simply refuses to abandon the self again. A healed empath doesn't become softer in the way the world imagines. They become steadier. And steadiness is what makes manipulators nervous, because chaos no longer moves you the way it once did. You still feel deeply, you still care, but your compassion finally has a container. If you've felt this shift, if you recognize the moment you stopped over-explaining, stopped abandoning yourself, leave a comment that says, "I stopped leaking." Let it mark the change. And if you're learning how to feel deeply without losing yourself, how to stay open without being drained, how to love without disappearing, you're in the right place.